Um, in his remarks, Deputy McGrath spoke about the need to balance the needs of and the rights of borrowers with those of the banks and the mortgage holders. And I mean, that is clearly something that I would agree with. It is indeed something I believe the Minister agrees with it and the entire government agrees with it. It's quite self-evident that we need to do that to live in a society which is just, but also to live in a functioning economy. And of course, it's very much in the bank's interest to ensure that the economy functions as efficiently, as economically as possible. Deputy McGrath, and to a far greater extent the people who sit on the independent benches behind him, paint a picture of banks where there's a rush to repossess, a desire to repossess, a desire to take over properties. And from what I would have heard when on the Finance Committee, in which Deputy McGrath sits, and indeed from what I would have heard locally in Clare, there are repossessions, certainly there are. And there are banks putting a lot of pressure on people. Some of that pressure should not be being applied. But the pressure is to pay the banks money. That the pressure, I don't sense, and I'm not certain there is in this country, a desire among the banks to repossess. There's talk of waves of repossessions. That simply, there is an increase in repossessions, particularly of investment properties, and obviously the provisions of this bill don't apply to investment properties. But banks are repossessing as a very last instance, and of course it's obvious that they would only do so as a last instance. I mean, why would a commercial entity seek to take a property that they have to then sell in a completely depressed market, and crystallise their losses? You see, I don't accept that there's a rush by banks to repossess. I think the banks are not acting as they should be acting. I think they're putting a lot of pressure on people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they want to repossess. I mean, I welcome the provisions in this that any such proceedings would be adjourned to seek a personal insolvency arrangement. I think that is crucial. I also would question, as I have previously questioned in this House, the rush to point out the failures and to deem the personal insolvency arrangement, which is just about to commence its work now, to deem that to be a failure in advance of it even operating after years of nothing operating. I mean, I think we have to give this a chance. Minister Shatter is on the record as saying that if the banks stonewall this, if they don't cooperate with this, and it's of course unlikely that they won't cooperate with this. It is, after all, in their economic interests, and they, of all, are cold, hard commercial creatures, but it is in their interest to make this work. But if they don't, Minister Shatter has indicated that this government will review the legislation. But the banks go into this personal insolvency process knowing that in certain instances, in many instances, the alternative is a bankruptcy. So banks in a bankruptcy arrangement, they lose a lot more. Of course, if they're sufficiently secured, they may gain the property, but then they have to sell it in a depressed environment. The banks are not interested in property owning, unlike, I suppose, unlike the great majority of people who are caught in this horrendous situation. And there's one particular category of people that I wish to allude to while I'm on my feet, and there's a lot of noise coming from the GRA conference. Indeed, there's a lot of noise that comes from all such trade union conferences, association conferences, but usually amid the noise there's some grain of truth. And in this instance, I think it's finally out there in the public what a lot of us already knew, that a lot of Gardaí are in financial difficulties, some of them with their own personal mortgages.
Just to let you know, as a courtesy, you have 1 minute left.
Thank you, Chairman. But many in respect of investment properties. They're simply barely able to pay their own family home mortgage now in many instances, and they're simply not able to pay the investment mortgage if it falls, and isn't able to be isn't let out if there's a break in the tenancy for whatever reason. And there's a doubt. Now, I don't think there's a certainty, but there's certainly a doubt as to whether Gardaí and members of the Gardaí can enter into a personal insolvency arrangement. And if I see the Minister shake his head, if there is absolutely no doubt, and the Minister wishes to clarify that for the benefit of this House, it's something that I would greatly welcome. But there is a doubt, certainly, among members of the Garda Force whom I've spoken to, friends that I went to school with, constituents, neighbours. There is a doubt in their minds as to whether they can apply and enter into a personal insolvency arrangement without falling foul of their own code of conduct. Now, if there's no such doubt, greatly welcome the clarification, Minister. But as long as there is a doubt, I think it is something that has to be considered, and considered urgently, in the context of A, seeking to agree a solution to how we can arrive at the 300 million savings in the public sector payroll, but B, in the context of this particular bill.